What makes a Jew? Is Judaism a religion, a nation, a race, a set of values, an ancient philosophy? Or is it a genetic category? Is a Jew me, when I wear my grandpa's Yom Kippur costume? Or is it just when someone decides to call themselves a Jew? Regardless of how you might think, the State of Israel and its allies have their own understanding of this concept, and the consequences are felt gravely by both Jewish and Palestinian people across the world. In this insane, sprawling albatross of an essay, I will try to answer these questions, going from ancient biblical times to the emergence of modern anti-Semitism in the 19th century, and taking contemporary population genetics to task. But I will start with a now, with how Israel manipulates understandings of anti-Semitism to advance its own political ends.
Is it possible to be critical of the State of Israel without being accused of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I've been criticizing Israel since we started.
Are you a Mossad agent? Several people have suggested it online.
Maybe.
In 2018, journalist Aidan Pink revealed that the rising pro-Israel social media star Chen Mazig had been receiving tens of thousands of dollars from a shady arm of the Israeli government in violation of American anti-espionage laws. Allegedly. If you've been around the scene of young American and British Jews who are interested in Israeli politics, you've seen Chen Mazig, an eloquent pro-Israel speaker, who makes sure to preface every interview with the assertion that he's a gay Mizrahi Jew of color. The evidence presented in Aidan Pink's Jewish Daily Forward investigation, which includes Israeli Freedom of Information disclosures of payments given to Mazig from Israel's secretive Ministry of Strategic Affairs, suggests that Chen Mazig is participating in an Israeli IDPsyOp, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, leveraging the discourse of identity politics, intersectionality, and social justice to repress criticism of Israeli government policy and, more importantly, repress action against Israeli government policy. Mazig's assertion that he's a gay Jew of color who supports Israel and therefore the left hates him does problematize leftist dogma that equates identity with political positioning. However, the strength of Mazig's operation is precisely in that it functions as a form of Zionist entryism into progressive discourse, creating the mirage that Israel is congruous with woke politics. Never mind that homophobia is enshrined in Israeli law despite the pinkwashing, never mind the routine discrimination which Mizrahi Jews face, and never mind that Israeli security forces routinely exploit intel of Palestinians' queer sexuality by threatening to out them and thus turning them into informants. In his particular form of entryism, Mazig has established himself as a regular commentator on anti-Semitism. Israel's use of the anti-Semitism accusation is a major discursive weapon, targeting critics of Israeli policy indiscriminately, but perhaps most effectively when directed at those who politically align with anti-racism and social justice rhetoric. By leveraging and manipulating these progressive values against those who espouse them, this Israeli strategy seeks to claim a victim narrative on one hand, diverting attention from Israel's abuse of Palestinian rights, and fragment progressive coalitions on the other, thus harming the possibility for collective action. This would not have been possible without Israel's effort to monopolize Jewish identity, i.e., its claim that it is the state of the Jewish people, that it represents all Jews, and that a transgression against Israel is a transgression against the Jewish people as a whole.
We'll start tonight in the Middle East, where Israel... What? Israel isn't supposed to defend itself?
Oh yeah, if Mexico bombed Texas, will we exercise
restraint? What other country is held to the same standard as Israel?
People that want to destroy her terrorists?
What's the matter with you? It's the only democracy in the Middle East, you terrorist!
Self-hating Jew?
Jokes aside, the stakes here are deeply personal for me. And there's a personal reason that I find myself focusing on this crypto Mazig, because I see an entirely probable version of myself in him. If Israeli militarism had had its way in my own indoctrination, I too could have been weaponizing my intersecting identities and using woke politics to advance Israeli strategy in multiple terrains. But strangely, my disillusionment with Zionism, even though it was driven by a late youth experience that showed me that identity is incidental and arbitrary and that the racism I was taught was false, this disillusionment drove me back into a paradoxical reclamation of my Jewishness. In other words, Israeli dissidents like myself, those who oppose Israel's military dictatorship over millions of Palestinians and are alienated by Israeli nationalism, find ourselves in a contradictory bind. Our mere existence problematizes the legitimacy of the Israeli narrative, for it demonstrates that Israeli policy does not represent all Jews. But this creates a dynamic that encourages us to claim our dissenting Jewishness as a legitimate subjectivity. This locks us within the imprisoning, exclusionary, racist logic of identity essentialism that we are trying to escape in the first place. What's the way out? I will try to answer that by offering a different definition of what it might mean to be a Jew.
It has nothing to do with some ancient tribe of blah, blah, blah. That's not attached to your DNA, right? By the same logic, we all come from apes, but I don't throw ape in every conversation. Use ape to define myself. Use ape as an excuse to defecate in my thumbless mitt and then hurl it at you. I'm sorry, did I just splatter you with wet feces? I'm sorry, I have a very rich ape upbringing, a strong ape heritage.
I argue that the conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism too could be seen as an IDPsyOp, an implicit attempt to manipulate anti-racist sentiment in order to justify racist policy, a leveling of a racist accusation against those who stand against racism, a strategic instrumentalization of identity politics for the purpose of repressing, in this case, calls for Palestinian equality. Now, I'm going to go on a bit of a detour into philosophy and military theory in order to justify this claim. So bear with me, because it's gonna be a banger. Maybe. I don't know. Or feel free to skip to the next section head via the description stuff, which I will figure out how to do when I upload this. In his stellar work, Necropolitics, Achille Mbembe argues that the state derives its sovereignty from the capacity to declare a state of exception and exercise it as the power to control life and death, i.e. necropower, the power to dictate, in Mbembe's famous opening words, who is able to live and who must die. He goes on to use Israel as an exemplary case, writing that the most accomplished form of necropower is the contemporary colonial occupation of Palestine. Here, the colonial state derives its fundamental claim of sovereignty and legitimacy from the authority of its own particular narrative of history and identity. This narrative is itself underpinned by the idea that the state has a divine right to exist, a narrative that competes with another for the same sacred space. The idea that a colonial settler state would derive its sovereignty and legitimacy from a constructed narrative of history and identity is backed by the cutting edge of contemporary military theory, specifically as it relates to counterinsurgency, or COIN, which is fundamental to military occupations. According to the US Army's Joint Publication Manual for Counterinsurgency, all governments govern through a combination of consent, influence, and to some degree coercion. The state's level of political legitimacy is achieved through the construction and control of narratives. Military and political strategy are both derived from narrative. Mbembe, too, stresses the important role of the humanities and social sciences, especially in Israel's case of narrative construction, saying history, geography, cartography, and archaeology, and, as I will discuss, race science and genetics, are supposed to back these claims, thereby closely binding identity and topography. This leads me to posit three major achievements of the Zionist project. A. The popularization of Hebrew as a spoken contemporary language. Footnote: here I'm following Israeli sociologist Vered Vinitsky-Sarusi, who argued at a class I snuck into at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem that the revival of the Hebrew language is the greatest achievement of Zionism, though I'm deliberately avoiding the word revival, which, as evidenced by the ethnographic work of Nahum Slush, may be a myth of Zionist exceptionalism. B. The subordination of Judaism and Jewish identity to the Zionist historical and theological narrative. i.e. the divine right to return and colonize ostensibly biblical territories. C. The instrumentalization of the terror of the Holocaust as a foundational claim to legitimacy and sovereignty. All subsequent notable achievements, the establishment of the State of Israel through the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the subjugation of millions of Palestinians to a seemingly resilient apartheid regime, are derivatives of these discursive technologies. Other material accomplishments, such as Israel's becoming the world's leading military exporter per capita by a wide margin, or its top-ranking startup industry, the two are closely related, are hollow trophies in comparison, deadly outputs of a necropower that begins in the mind. Identity construction is key, here and elsewhere, for the success of the colonial project. The Jewish people are forced into the broader late modern colonial project as frontline settlers. Jewish Zionist identity, again, central to the Zionist project is the enmeshment of the two, is constructed in accordance with the white supremacist guideline established overseas. Racecraft is utilized to create solidarity across class by wholly adopting the 19th century anti-Semitic notion that Jews everywhere are of a single race or ethnicity that originates in the Middle East. Oh, that's Israel weaponizing anti-Semitism to silence all criticism of its policies while essentializing Judaism and claiming to represent all Jews through an episteme that is eerily familiar from 19th century anti-Semites and pseudoscientists saying Ashkenazi Jews were not European but strange Asiatics who came from the Middle East and should therefore... Jewish society is then stratified accordingly with further racecraft and identities. Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Russian, Ethiopian, where the lower classes are relegated to the grunt work of occupation and ethnic cleansing. Palestinian becomes a counter-identity, encompassing the native subject. As it catalyzes a revolutionary project, it must be destroyed. The Zionist project attempts to accomplish this by fragmenting the native population into further identity groups. Instead of Palestinian, the colonizer sees Druze, Bedouin, Israeli Arab, and other Arab groups. Some identities are affirmed by highlighting and recruiting from existing traditional religious and cultural differences, i.e. Druze, Bedouins, as what Membe calls local auxiliaries who could assist in the management of conquered territories, while others are constructed from scratch, i.e. Israeli Arabs. Arab identity is then annexed to the Middle Eastern landscape. You know, the phrase, they have 22 Arab countries they can go to, or something like that. Aiding in the denial of Palestinian indigeneity. The occupied West Bank is made through what Fanon would call the principle of reciprocal exclusivity into an assemblage of ghettos administered by auxiliary colonial forces of the Palestinian Authority, or the PA, which is allowed to exist inasmuch as it maintains its very effective complicity with apartheid rule. Gaza becomes a death world, a shadow lurking between topologies. Going back to the US Army's counterinsurgency manual, to tie all of this together with the idea that the anti-Semitism accusation is an IDPsyOp, the US Army stresses operatively that coin planners should compose a unifying message, the coin narrative, that is consistent with the overarching USG, US government, narrative, which is coupled to the USG objective. We can see how achievements B and C establish this narrative for Israel, i.e. that the Jewish people have been and will be hated and horrifically persecuted by anti-Semites all over the world throughout history and forever, and that the establishment of the Israeli state, capable of defending itself in the land given by God to the Jews, is necessarily the only answer to their miseries. Now let's see what kind of discursive and counterinsurgent actions are developed from this narrative today. Hasbara is the Hebrew word for explaining and is understood as the term for pro-Israel propaganda. In 2009, the American-Israeli NGO called the Israel Project, TIP, commissioned a confidential Hasbara manual from pollster and political communication strategist Frank Luntz. This manual was to be used by those who, per TIP founder Jennifer Mizrahi's introductory note, are on the front lines of fighting the media war for Israel. Every one of the 117 pages of Luntz's leaked study is marked not for distribution or publication, and it's easy to see why. With minute detail, shaped by comprehensive polling, the report provides the guide for Israeli spokespeople in answering difficult questions about Israeli practice, from the bombing of hospitals and the killing of children in Gaza to the continued expansion of Israeli settlements, i.e. colonies, past UN-approved borders. There is no Israeli crime that these pundits won't seek to justify. The central line, which the report recommends, is the strategic exploitation of human empathy in order to turn the tables and turn Israel, in Luntz's words, from bully to victim. Key to this press strategy is a cynical use of anti-Semitism as an exploitation of woke anti-racist sentiments. This, for example, is the talking point crowned by the study as the best settlement argument, basically the best argument to justify continued settlement expansion. If we are to have real peace, then Israelis and Palestinians will have to live side by side. The idea that anywhere that you have Palestinians, there can't be any Jews, that some areas have to be Jew-free, is a racist idea. We don't say that we have to cleanse out Arabs from Israel. They are citizens of Israel. They enjoy equal rights. We cannot see why it is that peace requires any Palestinian area would require a kind of ethnic cleansing to remove all Jews. We don't accept it. Cleansing by either side against either side is unacceptable. None of this, of course, is meant in the first place to have any factual basis. From the assertion that Palestinians who neighbor settlements are citizens of Israel to the claim that they enjoy equal rights, neither is true. The point is rather to win new hearts and minds for Israel in the ongoing media war. This doctrine, the Luntz report, became the guide for pro-Israel pundits across the board, and we can see its conclusions coming about in Israel's media strategy after literally every large-scale army operation and massacre that happened since its publication.
Fortunately, innocents do get hurt, and we really grieve that.
We're sad for every civilian casualty.
The entire situation is tragic. Have thousands of rockets raining down on our civilians.
Rockets were raining down on Israel.
Down on southern Israel.
Rockets raining down on Israel.
Well, Hamas rockets rained down on the Israeli border.
So what would you do in the United States?
Can you imagine what America would do if it were facing a similar threat?
We always try to ask you the question we ask ourselves. What will you do? What would you do?
Now, the externalities of this media strategy, the consequences outside of the direct goal of the IDPsyOp, which is the silencing of pro-Palestinian positions, are dangerous for a few reasons. One, it's an equation that works both ways. If we say that people who oppose the state of Israel are anti-Semites, then we also imply that actual anti-Semites are people who uphold Palestinian rights. The accusation, therefore, strengthens anti-Jewish racists as it puts them in a positive light. Following this logic, the accusation hollows out the term anti-Semitism of any meaning. The term becomes incoherent or irrelevant, allowing racists who support Israel to disguise their anti-Semitism. We saw this in the most chilling ways at the height of the Trump administration.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
Trump repeatedly deflected when asked to disavow former KKK leader David Duke.
Last week, headstones were toppled at a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri.
Police are investigating a slew of bomb threats targeting Jewish community centers all across the country today.
Jews will not replace us!
You know, I'm proud to have that German blood. There's no question about it. Great stuff.
Huh. Well, surely Israeli leaders who are funding anti-racist speaker series at US colleges would be quick to call out Donald Trump for this Hitlerian spectacle.
There is no greater supporter of the Jewish people and the Jewish state than President Donald Trump.
Ooh, what? He did it, so he didn't No, but he's... yeah. How did this dangerous hollowing out and strategic manipulation of anti-racist discourse come to define Israel's narrative strategy? This question will take us back in time to the origins of the concepts of anti-Semitism and the Jewish people. But we'll work our way backwards. In his article, Strange Bedfellows ? Strange Bedfellows? Anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the Fate of the Jews, Scott Uri, who is a professor of Jewish history at Tel Aviv University and a convener of the International Consortium for Research in Anti-Semitism and Racism, he traces Israel's contemporary use of the anti-Semitism accusation to Zionist scholar Shmuel Ettinger. I think in the Anglophone world, only specialists know about Ettinger, but in Jerusalem, they name academic centers after him and stuff. In 1985, Ettinger wrote a government-published Hebrew essay titled Anti-Semitism and Anti-Zionism Among Youth in the Western World, where he claimed that hostility toward Israel on the European left was proof of the long, irrepressible, and potentially indelible nature of anti-Semitism. Ettinger, in Uri's framework, became a bridge between the anti-Semitic epistemology of 19th century Zionists and the ostensibly postmodern Zionism of the Israeli state today. In his historical survey, Uri shows how Zionism was bound to anti-Semitism through a series of fundamental axioms, and that Zionist leaders, especially the founder of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, were keenly aware of the strangely mutually beneficial relationship between the two. Both political anti-Semitism and Zionism sought to empty Europe of Jews, and for Herzl, anti-Semitism would serve as nothing less than the very motor that would generate the imminent transformation and ultimate regeneration of the Jews. Thus, both advocates of anti-Semitism and early Zionist leaders brought into being the understanding of Jews as a people, as opposed to a religion, a nation that is distinct and separate from the European nations. And I'll add that the establishment of European nationalism, the establishment of European nations, was itself grounded in the establishment of the Jewish people as a foreign people. So Jews served as a kind of other for the creation of European nations. From here, the connection to the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish dual loyalty becomes evident in that German Jews become estranged from the German nation. French Jews are not a real part of France. Herzl understood this. In his book, The Jewish State, he wrote, "It might reasonably be objected that I am giving a handle to anti-Semitism when I say we are a people, one people." At least you can hear me better with this mic. I can't whack it when I wave my hands around. I also feel really tight in this suit. It's not really my grandpa's. It's just something I found in a free box somewhere, but I'm just gonna open a button here. Truthfully, this is the suit I wear for Yom Kippur service, you know, the holiday when Jews ask for forgiveness for their sins so they can get them expunged and sin peacefully during the next year. Basically, this is me asking for forgiveness for this video ahead of time, you know. Sorry. The term anti-Semitism was popularized by German journalist Wilhelm Marr in 1881 and first appeared in print 2 years beforehand as a scientific-sounding term for hatred of Jews, even though it is terminologically misleading and incoherent, but we're gonna use it anyway because we don't want to be self-referential academics. The idea that it was a one-of-a-kind, unique form of racism forever conjoined to the Jews like a force of nature was basically the rallying cry for Jewish nationalism, i.e. Zionism, i.e. this notion that Jews had no choice but to separate from all non-Jewish people and establish their own ethnostate, preferably in the Middle East. But this idea was not shared by the majority of Jews. An important example, which Judaic scholars tend to ignore, is the Jewish Labor Bund, which was a huge international anti-Zionist organization of East European Jewish socialists who insisted on staying in their land and fighting fascism and racism with their fellow workers where they were. To this day, Zionists keep co-opting the Bundist partisans who led anti-fascist rebellions in ghettos and concentration camps, but the Zionists, to their eternal shame, in fact collaborated with Nazism by breaking the Jewish boycott on Nazi Germany with the 1933 Transfer Agreement, which stipulated that German Jews would be able to join the Zionist colonial effort in the Middle East in exchange for the circulation of German goods in the budding Zionist economy of British Mandate Palestine. But the Bundists were not the only ones to reject Zionist epistemology. According to Scott Uri, the prominent Jewish scholars of the following generation, most of whom wound up migrating from East and Central Europe to America, were very critical of the baseline assumptions around what makes the Jews Jews and whether anti-Semitism was an eternal force of nature that will forever plague them anywhere but in their own separate apartheid ethno-state, or actually a form of racism that is contextual and specific at different points in history. But Shmuel Ettinger revived this mystification of anti-Semitism in the service of Israel in the 1980s. One of the things that make Ettinger such a compelling and successful vessel for this reactionary nationalist episteme is that he came out of the internationalist left. Born in what is at the moment contemporary Ukraine, Ettinger migrated to Palestine in 1936 and became a dedicated member of the Palestine Communist Party. But in 1946, he revisited the Soviet Union for a few months and was bitterly disillusioned. Informed by his own experiences of anti-Semitism, he became a vociferous critic of the Soviet Union and the global left, and saw criticism of racist Israeli policy as, quote, little more than a poorly constructed fig leaf designed to camouflage the deep undercurrent of anti-Semitism that stained and polluted European history and society, end quote. Ettinger's formulations of the eternal relationship between anti-Semitism and Judaism, per Uri, shaped the way in which the next generation of scholars understood, taught, and wrote about anti-Semitism, most notably Robert Wistrich, who was the most prolific scholar of anti-Semitism of the past few decades, and made a killer of a career compiling thousands of pages of pseudo-academic nonsense on how the Spanish Inquisition, Nazism, and, I don't know, a band of grandmas calling for the boycott of your least favorite brand of hummus are all part of the same innate, unending, inherent hatred of the Jews since the beginning of time. So, one of the things that make Ettinger's case so compelling is that it's easy to genuinely empathize with him. In contrast with Israeli spokesmen who follow the guidelines of the Luntz report in the most cynical and manipulative ways, his analysis stems from what I believe is totally justified resentment towards the internationalist left. You know, truly fucked up experiences of anti-Semitism that he had had in the Soviet Union. But none of this changes the fact that his conclusions are wrong, and work to construct a mythology that whitewashes the murderous daily nightmare for millions of Palestinians, as well as the criminalization of anyone who calls to end this nightmare. And now that I said that, I need to take you back in time to the origins of the Jews. But before I do, let me just make it perfectly clear that regardless of this historical debate, no kind of actual or imagined historical connection to a land 2,000 years ago justifies the horrors of Israeli colonization and apartheid, and I strongly encourage viewers to familiarize themselves with its precise machinations. I'll include a list of film and book recommendations in the descriptions. So let's do this. Time machine effect. In her 2013 book, Jew, mainstream Judaic scholar, let's try this again. In her 2013 book, Jew, Judaic scholar Cynthia Baker conducts a sweeping historical study that traces the word Jew back to the formation of early Christianity, a figure of the other that had to be invented in order to facilitate an imperial Christian subjectivity. The term Jew itself derives from, quote, the character of the betrayer in the Christian gospel narratives, Judas. Baker demonstrates etymologically and historically that the ancient Judeans, that you'll hear about as the original Jews in terrifyingly popular pseudo-historical animations such as Past to Future's History of Jews in 5 Minutes, in fact have no demonstrated connection, historically or genetically, to the Jews of today. What the fuck are these 19th century Hasidic Jews doing in 300 BC Syro-Phoenicia? I don't know. It follows that Per Baker, an anti-Semitic association of betrayal and two-facedness, dual loyalty, and treachery was encoded into the term that has become an elusive signifier of a people and a religion, either or both, an ethnicity and a nation, both or neither. Baker reviews the formulations of and debates around the definition of Jew in terms of ethnicity/race and religion, in order to show that the ethnic category of Judeans was rendered, quote, defunct, so as to be replaced by a theologically constituted Jews that, quote, is/are a Christian construct. The conflation between Jews, the Christians other, and Judeans, a biblical people, has become a defining feature of Zionist epistemology, as well as Nazi Weltschauung. Baker continues to examine Jews' identity formation and subjecthood up to the contemporary era to show that Zionism's new Jew, the Zionist Übermensch, a term coined by a famous anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist, this Aryan-looking Chalutz pioneer was born out of the rejection of the Jew as neurotic, degenerate, effeminate, ruthless, and money-grubbing. In other words, the Zionist new Jew was and is a nationalist, proto-fascist, anti-Semitic construction as much as it is a reaction to anti-Semitism. Baker says this outright. Turn-of-the-century Zionism's new Jew, then, although set forth as a proud countermodel and bold response to the unhealthy, degenerate Jew of early science and European Romantic nationalism, is itself clearly a product of those same discourses. She then goes on to quote fucking Jabotinsky himself, the father of the branch of Zionism that created Likud, Israel's largest political party, in the most unhinged, racist pseudoscience that could just as easily have been written by Goebbels. Garbles? A Jew brought up among Germans may assume German custom, German words. He may be wholly imbued with that German fluid, but the nucleus of his spiritual structure will always remain Jewish because his blood, his body, his physical racial type are Jewish. There can be no assimilation as long as there is no mixed marriage. An increase in the number of mixed marriages is the only sure and infallible means for the destruction of nationality as such. A preservation of national integrity is impossible except by a preservation of racial purity. Again, this is not Hitler, this is a Zionist leader in this obsession with mixed marriage, or in Hebrew, hitbolelut, is now a defining feature of Israeli racism against Palestinians because intermarriage performed in the country is not legally recognized. Public outcry bursts periodically with any news of celebrity interfaith couples, and Arab men who date Israeli women are subjected to right-wing harassment and physical assault. It follows that per-Zionism's anti-Semitic eugenics, Ashkenazi Jews are not European but strange Asiatics who came from the Middle East and therefore have a right to colonize it. With this racist epistemology, it should come as no surprise that Herzl himself said, "The anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies." Today's genetics is the 19th century's race science. The Zionism of today is essentially the same ideological framework as that of Herzl and Jabotinsky. Israeli apartheid seems a little bit like a time capsule, a contemporary incarnation of late-stage colonialism that just hangs on to the 21st century like a particularly persistent stain. But there are some differences. Membe shows these differences philosophically, framing Israeli apartheid through a postmodernist lens, conjoining Eyal Weizman's Deleuzian analysis of Israeli military occupation strategy with a Fanonian understanding of colonial space. In this section, I'm going to focus on the epistemological changes from early Zionism to today, mainly the notion that race science eugenics, and phrenology that were used to craft Jews as a people and a race by early Zionists have fallen out of favor after World War II, only to be replaced by a similarly pseudoscientific understanding of population genetics. You've all heard of 23andMe and Ancestry.com's genetic tests. I'm going to try to show how Zionists use this field and why it is nonsensical. In The Invention of the Jewish People, Israeli historian Shlomo Zand discusses how early Zionism had to resort to the scientific field of biology in order to reinforce the foundation of the ancient Jewish nation, without alienating what was, at least at the time, its militantly secular base. With World War II and the global disillusionment with race science, to the extent that in 1952 even the UN published a much publicized study held by an army of scientists claiming that, quote, the concept of race was a social myth rather than a scientific fact, Israeli scholarship simply shifted its focus to anthropological and archaeological studies to keep sort of maintaining its belief in the common origin of the wandering people and keep indoctrinating the next generation of Zionists, my parents. The Jewish race disappeared from the vocabulary of conventional research, but it was replaced by a scientific field with a respectable title, the study of the origin of the Jewish communities. This hiatus continued until a 1978 British study headed by Arthur E. Morant opened the floodgates for Jewish population genetics. In the introduction to his study, Morant confessed that for most of his life he had followed an obscure sectarian belief that the British people were in fact descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and that the British capture of Palestine was the beginning of salvation, hence his interest in the Jews. This is reminiscent of some other Anglophones who have unhinged beliefs about the Jews but wield tremendous political power.
I'm proud to be a Christian Zionist. That's why I'm proud to be a partner to one of the greatest nations on earth and the foundation of the Judeo-Christian West.
An old Yiddish saying says that a Philo-Semite is an anti-Semite who loves Jews. Two sides of the same coin standing on its side. Morant adapted his biblical fantasy to his scientific research, first by claiming that Jews of Sephardic and Ashkenazi origin shared a higher frequency of A and B alleles than their non-Jewish neighbors. However, when geneticist Raphael Falk looked closely at the data, he saw that it did not show that Jews were genetically coherent at all. But Morant just went ahead and made his conclusions anyway, never mind that the terms Ashkenazi and Sephardi represent different varieties of religious ritual and not racial categories in the first place. This bullshit study, held by an English scientist from Oxford University, this bullshit study was hailed in the Israeli science monthly Mada for its path-breaking originality and became the Anglo-Saxon stamp of legitimacy to enable Zionists to bring back the racist episteme that's been latent since World War II. Soon, Israeli universities in Haifa, Jerusalem, and Tel Aviv started churning out studies in a similar vein, frequently blending historical myths with sociological assumptions and shady genetic findings. Israeli geneticist Raphael Falk's book, Zionism and the Biology of the Jews, is a treasure trove of Zionist and Israeli researchers' mind-bogglingly racist pseudoscience. Falk discusses how a common phenomenon, this shouldn't be my job. I've been stuttering since as a kid. My parents tried to determine whether I was a Jew or not by placing burning coal on one plate and chocolate on another. I mean gold on another, and seeing which plate I would reach for. That makes sense. Falk discusses how a common phenomenon of these genetic studies is their tendency to shoot the arrows and then draw the targets around them. I'll explain. In her book Jew, Cynthia Baker also does a takedown of population genetics and effectively continues the work of Shlomo Zand without citing him. And I'll try to tell you why I think that is and kill off any thin remnants of academic job prospects for myself in just a minute. Human population genetics is a discipline devoted to exploring polymorphisms in gene and genotype frequencies within and between human populations over multiple generations. It has been called the most widely misused area of human genetics, largely because findings are readily appropriated into pre-existing cultural narratives where they may be presented as proof in support of a variety of socio-political agendas. In addition, determination of what constitutes a population, critical decisions for the purposes of designing or interpreting genetic studies, can also be deeply entwined with popular concepts of race and other essentialist notions of identity. Given these issues and the veritable explosion in genomic research and its applications in recent decades, some scholars have expressed concern that we have entered an area of the molecularization of race. This is not to say that all genetics is nonsense or that there are no inherent qualities to the human genome, but just that as a budding field, it often lends itself to manipulation by capitalist nationalists and other racists. And unfortunately, these types of people are the ones who set the tone for the field and determine what kind of research gets funded and produced and what kinds of narratives it upholds. This is demonstrated very clearly in this paper that has a catchy title, Abraham's Children in the Genome Era. Major Jewish diaspora populations comprise distinct genetic clusters with shared Middle Eastern ancestry. I think that's an iambic pentameter. Written by 11 scientists associated with major research institutions around the world, this 2010 study has been widely cited and remains chillingly popular despite its insane amalgam of biblical, biological, and histographic mythologies, which somehow comprise the hegemonic narrative of Jewish politics today. The first sentence will tell you that Jews originated as a national and religious group in the Middle East during the 2nd millennium BCE and have maintained continuous genetic, cultural, and religious traditions since that time. Looks like all Jewish history programs ever should just stop debating. The study cited a dated 1970s book by Zionist historian Chaim Hillel ben Sasson, and already we can see that the stone has hit its target before it was even thrown.
By virtue of the authority vested in me. Oh, lay off, we haven't started yet. Come on, who's through that?
Describing their methodology, they state that subjects were included only if all 4 grandparents came from the same Jewish community. Again, those categorizations of Jewish communities are themselves contentious, plus, of course, there's no way for us to know if all 4 of those grandparents or their parents simply converted into Judaism, because anyone can do that. Don't tell the geneticists. With this working methodology, they picked 305 of what they saw as pure-blooded Jews from what they call Iranian, Iraqi, Syrian, and Ashkenazi Jewish communities in New York, as well as Jews in Seattle, Rome, Greece, and Tel HaShomer. Then, to assure that members came from the stated community, they removed samples that deviated too much from the mean PC position, so they basically pre-selected samples to define Jews as a distinct people, and then when samples didn't fit the assumption that Jews were a race, they just excluded them. Okay, they were then left with 237 samples of cherry-picked, pure-blooded Jews that they compared to unrelated gene pools from other communities all over the world in order to ultimately conclude that over the past 3,000 years, both the flow of genes and the flow of religious and cultural ideas have contributed to Jewishness. So they arbitrarily designate a genetic grouping that could then be used by racists to either include or exclude people from Judaism based on genetics and according to whatever racist interests they have. The genocidal implications are obvious, but let's slow down to explain just how scientifically off the rails this premise is. The human genome is comprised of 23 chromosome pairs that have 3 billion base pairs. This is an enormous amount of data. If there is any degree of genetic isolation in a community, from a village to a city to a group of Lord of the Rings LARPers, you will be able to find information about their fornication habits in this very intricate data. But from here to extrapolate that this information makes a people or a race, which again is not a genetic category, would enable you to make any arbitrary genetic grouping into a racial category. You could just as easily use this methodology to argue that any nation is a race, that New York is a race, American, Tolkienite. It could easily be used as a method to justify the tokenization, exclusion, or annihilation of populations according to one's political agenda. But the expensive authors of this expensive pseudoscience don't even stop at extrapolating that Jews everywhere are a race. They maintain the established racecraft within Judaism itself by claiming that there's genetic difference between two Jewish groups, Middle Eastern Jews and European/Syrian Jews. The last time I checked, Syria was considered part of the Middle East, but maybe we should just check quickly right now. Yep, Syria is still part of the Middle East, but these scientists bring a whole other mythology to justify this category. Given that they perceive a high degree of 30 to 60% European admixture within their sampling, footnote, to juxtapose Jews with what they call Europeans of unmixed ancestry is fucking sus. But apparently these are standard terms of the trade in today's population genetics. The author's argument that 40% of Ashkenazi Jewish mitochondrial DNA is Middle Eastern was later thoroughly disputed by a 2013 international study conducted by 17 scientists with no Israeli funding that used a much larger sampling and claimed that, quote, the great majority of Ashkenazi maternal lineages were not brought from the Levant, as commonly supposed, but assimilated within Europe. But this study remains, for some reason, much less cited than Abraham's children, despite the fact that it's more recent, more rigorous, more detailed, and much more careful with its historic generalizations. The thing is, because the definition of Jew is disputed and vague, and this holds for the definition of any race, you will be able, within the enormous wealth of genetic data that is available in any group of people, to find evidence to corroborate pretty much any genetic claim. The bottom line is that these ongoing studies will never produce the desired results, because the baseline assumptions from which they set out are incoherent, because the term Jew itself cannot, genealogically as opposed to genetically, be a race. Returning to our framing of IDPsyOps, we can say that, therefore, the construction of Jew as a racial identity is a type 3 IDPsyOp generated as a Christian other through a racist 19th century episteme with the effect of dividing societies and directing popular rage away from the exploitative elites. By now, it should be clear to all viewers that none of this has anything to do with our beautiful Jewish rituals, customs, traditions, food, literature, or music. Elites have been using Jews as a stand-in for anything they don't like, be it a global communist conspiracy for American racists and the early mid-20th century, or part of an international cabal of bankers for Soviet racists. Clearly, the result is a cross-class, hate-based alliance between the elites and the masses they exploit. As I've demonstrated, Zionists have been playing a key role in establishing, containing, and propagating this notion of a racial identity, much to the benefit of anti-Semites the world over. But they still don't have a monopoly over Judaism. There is still value in our traditions, literature, theology, gefilte fish, humor.
Will you just taste the soup? All right, I'll taste the soup. Where's the spoon? Aha! Aha!
We just need to make sure not to allow these signifiers to be absorbed into an exclusionary identitarian framework. Adorno, who is sometimes considered a Jewish thinker and would certainly be seen as a Jew by Hitler, but who did not actually identify as a Jew, saw in Jewishness a potential for a liberatory non-identity or counter-identity. For him, Auschwitz confirmed the philosophy of pure identity as death. In Adorno's conception, heterogeneity, difference, multiplicity, in his own jargon non-identity, was the principle of life and the cultural marker for non-identity was the Jew. In this light, I'd like to offer this following definition as a radically inclusive definition of a Jew. A Jew is anyone who identifies as such. The word may connote a certain cultural complex of globally encompassing traditions, customs, literatures, and languages, but there is no one authoritative body that can designate what these are. To be a Jew is simply to be related to this cultural complex by association and not by obligation. And that's my definition. Most other definitions you'll find, from Wikipedia to the Israeli state to the Chief Rabbinate Council to Third Reich Germany, will tell you otherwise, and each will have their own highly consequential definitions, but none of them can claim authority over this non-identity. What you'll find, if you interrogate the many sources I've cited and go down your own rabbit hole of Judaic studies scholarship, is that this position, at least in academia, isn't even controversial. It simply reflects the reality of Jew over 2 millennia. Okay, and now, the reason you're all here. I'm gonna respond to PhilosophyTube, who I love, has been so inspiring to me and certainly influential for my work, and is certainly one of the reasons I'm trying this thing out at all. None of this is really to shit on her specifically. It's more like trying to understand how this IDPsyOp works and trying to give a degree of nuance to the conversation that truly is harmful. So if Abigail Thorne is watching this, all respect and love to you. Don't take it personally. We can keep chatting about this. Also, I haven't scripted this. Hopefully it works out. I'm just gonna try to wing it.
People, and that can limit the sorts of discussions.
This is how I watch most of these
This can especially be a problem if we are criticizing the Israeli government.
Oop.
Somewhere in YouTube, someone just slammed the demonetize button. Mais ne t'inquiète pas. C'est PhilosophyTube. Tu es entre de bombes.
It's funny,
Voilà les lumières.
I wonder if this is like a British thing.
In which she says the way to do it is to be specific about what
Maybe
you
I should
are
steal the
criticizing.
doobly-doo.
To say that Israel has an ongoing history of human rights violations, whatever you think of that, is specific and clear. To say Israel is the root of all the evil in the world, or to only focus on Israeli human rights abuses, kind of seems like your problem is actually with Jewish people.
No. Okay, this is a very common Zionist talking point. It's this idea that there's a double standard and that people who speak about Israeli violations are only talking about Israel. I think maybe in this present day and age, this has been thoroughly debunked. I mean, probably not, but it should be thoroughly debunked simply by looking at the global, or especially like liberal double standard with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how immediately sanctions are totally justified. They're not seen as a kind of racism against the Russian people. They're just a form of political action that can influence governments to change their policies or stop massacring people. Apparently this isn't enough in the case of Russia. Will it be enough in the case of Israel? I don't know, but I think it will be a start. And it will force Israel to make some changes, because Israel, unlike Russia, is totally dependent on international aid, especially from the United States of America. And it's almost $4 billion a year of military aid to Israel, not to mention other types of aid. Israel receives more aid than any other country in the world.
Zionism is the idea that Jewish people should have their own country, though of course how it should be run is another debate. A Zionist person might say, look, Jews have been persecuted all over the world.
She is missing the fact that their own Jewish country, this phrase itself, basically legitimizes an ethno-state, right? Like, what is their own Jewish country? Are you going to try to define what a Jewish country is, or what Jewish even means, Abigail? I don't think so. So this is a very contentious term, and by glossing over their own Jewish country, she's basically normalizing Israeli apartheid.
So we need a strong country under majority Jewish control to make sure that never happens again. And in response, an anti-Zionist person might say something like, okay, cool, but did you have to put the country there? Because there were already people living there and you can't just kill them. I mean, Israel came about because in 1917, Britain did a colonialism and invaded Palestine and supported the Zionist project, at least in part because they wanted to get rid of the Jewish people in Britain. They were like, oh, well, I suppose we'll just take all of the Jews and send them out to Palestine. And it wasn't a universally popular move. So in 1948, they were like, oh, it appears we've buggered it.
Yeah.
Is that the king calling me? I'm sorry, I have to go, everybody. It's a wonder I'm not invited to teach more history classes. Or hey.
It's true. Just notice how you can see the discomfort in the way she's delivering this video. Like, it's so cringy. She also notices that she's like walking on a shoestring here, if that's a phrase. And honestly isn't doing a great job. Like, totally is doing some of the conflations that we were talking about. So let me be clear. The way she falls into the IDPsyOp is in the way that she accepts the narrative that Israel is at all a Jewish state, which it is not. It is a colonial settler project that attempts to monopolize Judaism, but it is not a Jewish state, because it cannot possibly be, because no one can claim authority over this concept. So we see how the establishment of a Jewish identity creates this situation that allows a state like Israel to accuse everyone else of racism when they're held up to any kind of international standard of human rights, which in itself, of course, is problematic.
Could debate an anarchist, somebody who doesn't think anybody should have a country, right?
Oh, maybe I'll put myself like this. No, not like this. Let's be perfectly clear. Whether or not someone is an anarchist, this idea that Israel has a right to exist is absurd. It's basically like, I think an analogy could be like the idea that a corporation has inherent rights and can sue people for libel, or, has whatever kind of legal protections. So it's a legal absurdity that somehow Israel managed to enact in discourse, and we all need to accept that Israel has a right to exist. No, Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Israel does not have a right to exist. No state has a right to exist. People have a right to exist. States are inherently violent institutions that should be abolished.
Watch out. Wherever there are people criticizing Israel in a legit way, you will find others sneaking anti-Semitism in.
Wherever someone criticizes Israel in a legit way, someone will be sneaking anti-Semitism in. This is Zionist punditry par excellence, and it's absurd. And this is basically what's been used to delegitimize the BDS movement, which is honestly a pretty milquetoast liberal movement, let's face it. There are people calling for the violent smashing of colonial powers. You'll find it in any class where people talk about Fanon. But that's not what the BDS is trying to say. And still, they're accused of anti-Semitism. That's basically what Abigail Thorne is saying here. Basically, we're saying wherever there's criticism of Israel, there's anti-Semitism. She's basically calling me an anti-Semite. Seriously, Abigail, you should probably revisit this video. More than that, it's beyond the fact that she's calling me an anti-Semite, that Israel is conflated with the Jewish people, in itself is an anti-Semitic idea, because it assumes that we are all of a single ideological monolith, that we are all represented by this one body that calls itself Jewish. It's an anti-Semitic idea. And by suggesting that I'm an anti-Semite for criticizing Israel, Abigail is doing an anti-Semitism. I'm really generating controversy here, hopefully.
You'll find them saying Zionists when what they really mean is Jews.
Does anyone say Zionists and really mean Jews? Why are you generalizing in this way? If you hear Jews when people say Zionists, why are you inflicting it on your millions of viewers? It is honestly pretty shallow scholarship. Throughout the whole beginning of the video, she talks about, the Dreyfus affair, which, fair enough, it's an important story. It's also a story of basically an aristocrat and elite, high-ranking commander who was persecuted for being Jewish. But there are so many stories of the persecution of working-class Jews that should be discussed, maybe. I think the Zionist Anti-Semitism is part of the reason for which Abigail chose to focus on the Dreyfus Affair, because the Dreyfus Affair was taken up by Herzl and was one of the most radicalizing experiences for him. Okay, switch to the desk mic right here. Check it. Ooh, Herzl himself, it was after witnessing the Dreyfus Affair in the late 19th century, so its early iterations, that he decided Jews cannot possibly live in Europe, and I'm gonna fully adopt this Zionist movement thing, and became the founder of political Zionism as we know it, colonial Zionism, Tzionut Medinit, as they used to teach us in the Israeli indoctrination schooling system. So Abigail could focus on countless other atrocities that the Jews have faced, but she picks the Dreyfus Affair. And not only does she pick the Dreyfus Affair, she misses the highly contentious and complicated matrix of social forces that were at play during the Dreyfus Affair. So the Dreyfus Affair was really emblematic of the social transformations that were happening in Europe with the rise of nationalism, right? Because the French people were defined against a Hebrew other in a similar way to how the German people were defined against a Jewish other, and so on and so forth across Europe with the advent of nationalism. So this is an important part of nuance that should be considered. Also the fact that Émile Zola, like she mentions, the famous essay, J'accuse, the op-ed, really, the blog post, the tweet. Some of the reason that Émile Zola was discredited after saying it was also part of the same matrix of social forces, saying, oh, this Italianite, what does he know about the French people? So she didn't really do her homework. She gives so much, Wikipedia-style detail about the Dreyfus Affair without focusing on the broader picture. In effect, missing the forest for the trees. So it's sad. And it's sad that this does the service of disempowering pro-Palestinian movements and suggesting that any pro-Palestinian space has anti-Semitism in it that is being snuck in. And this is also the basic identity political idea, right? This is what I'm trying to disrupt with my whole project. This idea that there is a racism that is inherent to all of us, that is deep inside of us, that we can't see because it's subconscious, and that we need to ascetically work to deconstruct it for the rest of our lives. And therefore, we shouldn't act because we have to continuously question ourselves. But no, we should act. We should act for Palestinian liberation. We should act against the prison industrial complex, against the police. We should not let these psychological operations disempower us. And it's really sad that so many of the greatest creators on BreadTube fall for these things. But hey, hopefully we can change that. So you can help in changing that too by helping to spread these videos around, watching my earlier videos if you haven't yet, and please contribute to the conversation. I find that this format on YouTube really works for me and is really exciting, and I love sort of the creativity that it allows and the flexibility. If you want to help me keep on doing this, I might launch some kind of fundraising platform which you might be wanting to support after contributing to other more important things. So just think about it. How does it feel? And thanks so much for hanging around until now. Perhaps I'll put myself on the green screen, hit the subscribe button, do all the things. Oof, this was long. This was just 30 minutes of me talking into the camera. Oh my God, it's going to be such a fucking nightmare to try to edit this. All right, ciao.